Greetings, everyone, and welcome to a webinar by the Indiana Sustainable Energy Coalition. I am Kerwin Olson, the Executive Director at Citizens Action Coalition in Indianapolis, Indiana, presenting on behalf of the Indiana Sustainable Energy Coalition. We are a diverse coalition of consumer, environmental, civic groups, and solar advocates here in the state of Indiana, with a mission to advance policies that will support and expand customer-owned solar and wind power and other sustainable, environmentally healthy energy solutions in Indiana. Today's focus is customer-owned renewable energy generation. We'll talk about the meaning of customer-owned generation, the current policy landscape here in Indiana with a specific spotlight or focus on net metering. I'll provide background, definitions of some frequently used terms and words, the history of net metering in Indiana, threats to current policies, and the principles that should underlie future policies and what we should strive to achieve. I'll begin by talking about some basics of the electric utility industry here in Indiana. We have 5 investor-owned utilities, commonly referred to as IOUs, which serve approximately 80% of Indiana electric customers. They're listed on the screen. Duke Energy is the largest provider, followed by Indianapolis Power and Light, Northern Indiana Public Service Company, or NIPSCO, Indiana Michigan Power, also commonly called I&M, as well as Vectren or Sigaco, which is the smallest electric utility down in southwest Indiana. We also have 112 additional electric utilities that serve the remaining 20% or so of Indiana electric customers. 40 of those are rural electric cooperatives, also called REMCs and sometimes called co-ops. The largest co-op here in Indiana is South Central REMC, with approximately 33,000 customers, to kind of put into scale the size of the IOUs versus the size of the REMCs. In addition to the 40 REMCs, we have 72 municipal utilities, also commonly called munis, with the largest being the City of Anderson Municipal Electric Utility, with approximately 30,000 customers that they serve. The 5 investor-owned utilities are subject to the jurisdiction of the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, or the IURC. None of the REMCs here in Indiana are subject to the jurisdiction of the IURC. Rather, they are controlled by a board of directors, which is elected by the customers or the members of each REMC. Only 9 of the 72 municipal utilities are subject to the jurisdiction of the IURC regarding their basic rates and charges. Elected officials, mayors, city councils, and in most cases a utility services board or utility service office make most of the decisions regarding the municipal utilities. If you're interested in which specific utilities are subject to the IURC jurisdiction, there is a link there to the IURC website, which will display the current electric utilities here in Indiana that are subject to the jurisdiction of the IURC. Now we're going to talk about net metering. Net metering is a billing arrangement that credits owners of renewable energy systems for the electricity that they add to the electric grid. When the renewable energy system is generating more electricity than that customer is using, that energy is added to the grid, and the customer is credited at the retail rate or the same rate that they would pay for the energy they consume from the grid, or an even swap. Here's a visual that displays the interconnection of solar panels and what that looks like. The solar panels are there on the roof of the house that convert the sunlight to DC current. That energy then goes down to a inverter, which converts that from DC to AC power. Then that electricity either is consumed inside the house by the homeowner, or that electricity is sent to the electric grid. I think it's important to distinguish between net metering and other common billing arrangements that you may hear of. There's something called net billing, which many of the REMCs have, which is a similar physical arrangement as net metering. The primary difference between net billing and net metering is the amount that homeowners are credited for the excess energy that is added to the grid. There's also something known as a buy all, sell all approach. Well, what that means is all the energy generated by the renewable energy system is added to the grid. The homeowner would use none of that energy. It all goes onto the grid, and all of the energy used by the customer comes from the grid. So effectively, the customer does not use any of the energy from their renewable energy system to offset their own household energy use. All of the energy they use comes from the grid. Again, reflecting on some of the differences between net metering and the other arrangements, generally, the amount credited for energy added to the grid under net billing and or a buy-all, sell-all approach is usually at what's known as the utilities avoided cost. Those arrangements, unlike net metering, where the utilities retail rate is used to credit customers for the excess energy added to the grid. What is retail rate versus avoided cost? Well, retail rate, as we've discussed, is the rate that customers pay for the energy they use from the grid provided by the electric utility company. To put that a little bit of perspective on that, for residential customers, the average retail rate in the most recently available data from the Energy Information Administration was 11.1 cents per kilowatt hour. The avoided cost is the price a utility would pay if it had to either produce the power itself or purchase the power on the wholesale market. Generally, avoided costs are set once a year and vary greatly from as low as around 3 cents a kilowatt hour to as high as 6 cents or so per kilowatt hour. One very important distinction here is to understand that each utility, and again, we have 117 utilities here in Indiana, and each one of them has their own retail rates and they have their own avoided cost rates. Sometimes avoided cost rates are referred to as power purchase rates. And in order to know specifically what your utility's retail rates are and avoided cost rates, you need to check with your local utility. Again, we have 117 different electric utilities in Indiana, which means we have 117 different retail rates and 117 different avoided cost rates, and you need to check with your provider to find out specifically what those rates are. Now, this is a slide to display the many different categories of net metering and also what's known as meter aggregation, or the grouping of meters. We have on the left-hand side, you'll see single owner. We have single owner net metering, which is solar on or wind on one property, 1 meter, 1 owner. We have what's known as basic meter aggregation from a single owner, where a property such as a farm, for example, might have multiple meters, one on the home itself and one in the barn by the grain elevators. That's what's known as basic or contiguous meter aggregation. One owner, but multiple meters, all contiguous. And then we also have a single owner multi-site aggregation, where you would have the same owner, but they own multiple properties that and multiple electric meters that are not contiguous. Example, city-county, city-owned buildings. Then there's also multiple owners when it comes to meter aggregation. Two examples that we show here would be a tenant aggregation, where you have an apartment building, for example, where you would have solar on the roof, but you have multiple tenants in the building and multiple meters. And then virtual or community solar, which would allow the aggregation of the meters virtually, where you would have, this example is a community-owned solar project where you would have a solar array off-site somewhere, and you would have a group of homeowners that would own those solar panels, and they would be credited for the energy from those solar panels on their individual electric meters. And just want to recognize the Institute for Local Self-Reliance for providing this really useful slide. Now I'm going to talk about the history of net metering here in Indiana. First net metering rule should be understood that in Indiana, net metering is an administrative rule. It's not a state law. It's not in state statute. Has not been adopted in law by the Indiana General Assembly, but rather is a function of the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission through their authority to adopt administrative rules. Our first rule was adopted in March of 2005 and became effective later that year in May of 2005. And it had some significant limitations. First of all, it was applicable to only the investor-owned utilities, so only the 5 IOUs here in Indiana have to allow net metering. The system size was limited to 10 kilowatts, which is a very small array. Only residential customers and K through 12 schools were eligible for net metering. Commercial properties, business properties, municipalities, colleges, universities were not allowed to net meter under the initial rule. And the total capacity was very small, limited to 0.1% of the utility's annual peak load, which we'll get into a little bit later. We had a significant discussion at the Indiana legislature, the Indiana General Assembly, between 2004 and 2010 with respect to net metering. Multiple legislative hearings held throughout 2004 through 2009 with no success. The 2010 legislative session, we got very close. We had 2 bills, one from the House and one from the Senate, that both passed. Ryan Dvorak, representative from South Bend, had House Bill 1024, which passed the House by a wide bipartisan margin. We also had Senate Bill 313 from Senator Jim Merritt here in Indianapolis, which unanimously passed the Senate and also passed the House with bipartisan support. However, it died in the final days of the 2010 legislative session in conference committee, and there were significant areas of disagreement that went beyond partisan politics. Those areas of disagreement was, first of all, the eligible size of the renewable energy system, or how big of a system customers would be allowed to install on their property. There were limits as low as 100 kilowatts to as high as 5 megawatts. The total amount of aggregated capacity that would be allowed to net meter varied greatly from the existing 0.1% in the 2005 net metering rule to as high as 5% of the utility peak load. There was disagreement about any costs to connect to the grid, also known as interconnection costs, whether or not customers should pay to connect to the grid. There was significant disagreement about whether or not aggregation or the grouping of meters, which we talked about earlier, would be allowed. And the other disagreement was over the carryover of bill credits. Many of the amendments in the bills allowed indefinite carryover of any excess credits of surplus energy sent to the grid, while other bills or amendments to the language wanted those credits to expire at the end of every calendar year. But as a result of the lengthy dialogue that we had at the Indiana General Assembly in early 2010, Senator Jim Merritt wrote a letter that was widely publicized to, at that time, former Governor Mitch Daniels, to do what lawmakers ultimately could not do during the recently concluded legislative session, and that was push for progress on the issue of net metering. As a result of the discussion at the State House, as well as the letter from Senator Merritt, Governor Daniels had the IURC to begin a review process of net metering. There were 3 field hearings held throughout the state, one in Bloomington, one in Indianapolis, and one up in South Bend. There were formal comments filed by many people and many organizations and associations and businesses that were filed with the IURC and considered in writing a new net metering rule. And in May 2011, there was a final net metering and updated rule adopted here in the state of Indiana. The updated net metering rule in 2011 expanded the eligible customers to include all customers of the electric utility, commercial properties, industrial properties, municipalities, K through 12 schools, as well as residential customers. The size of the eligible system that would be allowed to net meter increased significantly from 10 kilowatts to 1 megawatt. The total system capacity was expanded from 0.1% to 1% of the utility's peak load, and that was done to address the alleged subsidy issue from net metering. Another good thing about the updated net metering rule was the prohibition on additional fees for level 1 interconnections, those interconnections being systems that would be under 10 kilowatts. There are some additional fees allowed for level 2 and level 3 interconnections, which are the bigger systems, and that hyperlink there will take you to the IURC rule on interconnection, which will spell out what those allowable fees are. And another great thing about the updated net metering rule was it did allow for the indefinite carryover of bill credits on customer bills from the excess energy that was sent back to the grid. So as a result of that updated net metering rule in 2011, where do we stand now here in Indiana? Well, the IURC 2015 net metering report has this graph in it, which will show you that starting in 2011, the amount of installations as well as total kilowatts installed has increased dramatically here in Indiana, as is displayed by the graph. There's also a great report done every year by the Interstate Renewable Energy Council called Freeing the Grid, or Best Practices in States Net Metering Policies. On the bottom there you can see Indiana's grades. Back in 2007, 2008, we were always a D or an F. As a result of the updated net metering rules, Indiana has improved to a B with the Indiana State, or with the Renewable Energy Council on Freeing the Grid report. However, as we discussed, the 1% cap of net metering capacity, where do we stand as a result of that? Well, the bottom in the blue is each utility's percentage of where they are at in terms of interconnected capacity with respect to net metering. I&M is only 2% of the way there. Duke and NIPSCO are both at 9%, with Vectren at 10%, and in the middle there is IPL at about 5%. So despite the significant growth in net metering installations here in Indiana, we still have an enormous amount of capacity that is available under the existing net metering rule. We're nowhere near approaching that cap, which was established by the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission in the 2011 net metering rule. And the net metering rule, despite being drastically improved over the 2005 rule, still has some limitations. It's silent on the issue of meter aggregation. There's some belief here that meter aggregation is illegal or against the law in the state of Indiana. Well, that's simply not true. The rule is silent on it. It's not prohibited. Utilities could allow meter aggregation if they wanted to. It limited the system size to 1 megawatt, while increasing the size to 1 megawatt was a significant accomplishment of the rule. It's still 1 megawatt is a small threshold for many municipalities and industrial customers that have a need for energy that exceeds 1 megawatt. So 1 megawatt is still holding back many larger customers from net metering. Similar to the 2005 rule, it's not a statewide rule which applies to all utilities. Just like the 2005 rule, it is limited to just the customers of the investor-owned utilities. So therefore, about 20% of Indiana electric customers may or may not have the ability to net meter, because the net metering rule in Indiana only applies to the 5 investor-owned utilities. And the net metering rule, just like meter aggregation, is silent with respect to the ownership of the renewable energy credits which result from the energy generated from those systems, and clarity on that issue would be a good thing moving forward, making it clear that the owner of the renewable energy system also owns the resulting renewable energy credits. So why are we here? Here come the monopolies. January 2013, there was a report done by the Edison Electric Institute known as Disruptive Challenges, Financial Implications and Strategic Responses to a Changing Retail Electric Business. It was a shot across the bow that discussed both solar energy and energy efficiency and the threat that that was posing to utility companies' revenues and profits, a call to arms, if you will. It was widely covered throughout the country. It resulted in fights across the country dealing with net metering rules and solar power, covered by NPR, the Washington Post, as well as the Wall Street Journal. Those are some of the three larger outlets that have covered this issue. What was the utilities' approach in this so-called war on solar as a result of the EER report? Raising fairness as an issue, basically saying that non-solar customers are subsidizing customers who own solar energy or other renewable energy systems, and that's simply not fair to the other customers. Utilities have raised class as an issue, basically using those without solar, specifically low-income customers, saying that those low-income customers are subsidizing those rich suburbanites with solar power. Again, using that as an excuse to challenge net metering as a subsidy. Utilities throughout the country have been proposing punitive monthly fees on owners of renewable energy systems, specifically solar energy. And utilities have been looking to change the design of their rates, how rates are structured, and making a move to increase monthly fixed costs on everyone, not just solar customers, but all customers. And this assault on solar by monopoly utility companies came to our state here in Indiana in the 2015 session of the Indiana General Assembly in the form of House Bill 1320. House Bill 1320 would have allowed utility companies to add a monthly charge to the bills of owners of solar energy or other renewable energy systems, would have allowed the utility companies to add onerous and unnecessary fees and rules for interconnection to the grid, and it would have allowed the utility companies to change the credits that customers would receive for the excess energy sent back to the grid from the current system of retail rate to the avoided cost rate, which again would have been a dramatic change and significantly change the economics of solar energy system, as the retail rate averages about 11 cents here in Indiana, while avoided cost rates are generally in the 3 to 4 cent range. Fortunately, the bill died on the floor of the House. House Speaker Brian Bosma removed it from further consideration, saying it had become, quote-unquote, a little weighty. Members of the Sustainable Energy Coalition, as well as the Christian Coalition, the Green Tea Party, and others put a lot of pressure on the Indiana General Assembly, and it was a convergence of folks from the left, folks from the right, and folks in the middle, basically saying House Bill 1320 is a bad idea for the state of Indiana, and Speaker Bosma made the right decision by removing it from further consideration. So where do we go from here? Well, we have barriers here in Indiana to sustainable energy policy. We have the current limitations that we've discussed under the current net metering rule. We have no renewable energy mandate here in Indiana. We no longer have an energy efficiency resource standard here in Indiana. We have no state tax credits for sustainable energy in our state, and we have very, very few champions of sustainable energy, either in the legislative branch of government here in Indiana or in the administrative branch. So what can we do to advance solar and sustainable energy here in our state? Well, first and foremost, it's critical that we protect what we've got. We've got to protect the current net metering rule. We have a lot of available capacity under that rule, as I've displayed here in the webinar, and we need to make sure that at a minimum we protect what we have. We need to advocate to improve that net metering rule to include the REMCs and the municipalities. It's a matter of equity. It's a matter of fairness. Net metering should be available to all electric customers in the state of Indiana, regardless of who their electric utility is. And we would need policy from the Indiana General Assembly to require that the REMCs and the municipals must offer net metering to their customers. We need to improve the net metering rule as well with meter aggregation. We need to enable community-owned solar and school corporations and municipalities and local government and renters, those that don't own their homes. We need to allow the aggregation of electric meters to expand those who can take advantage of solar energy and renewable energy here in our state. There's a strong appetite out there for community-owned solar and community-owned wind projects in Indiana, and we need to strongly advocate to allow for meter aggregation to enable those projects. We need to advocate for state tax credits, grant programs, incentives, especially for emerging technologies like energy storage, which aren't quite up to scale yet, and we need tax credits and incentives to get those things moving. We need to encourage our elected officials and our administrative officials to be champions. We need to form a sustainable energy caucus or an energy freedom caucus. We need to engage our elected officials and let them begin talking about these issues to advance solar energy and clean energy here in our state. And of course, you need to work with your local utilities. You need to understand that they are monopolies, which mean they make the rules. The net metering rule is a floor, not a ceiling. They can do more. And some utilities have, to their credit. So always start with working with your local utilities to get creative with projects that you and your colleagues may want to get done. And overall, we need to just advocate for increasing customer control over energy bills and energy usage. And lastly, and above all else, what we need is good process. We need assessment and analysis that's based on the conditions here in our state, that's based on sound data. We need collaboration, open discussion, transparent discussion with all stakeholders at the table. Conversations shouldn't be limited to just legislators and the utility companies. Anyone interested in a dialogue should be able to participate in that discussion. We need decisions that are driven by data. We need to identify the data that we need, collect and report that data publicly, and then use that data to make good decisions. We need testing. We need pilot projects on future policies before wide-scale adoption. And we always need to keep an eye on our low-income and vulnerable populations and the impact that any policy may have on those populations. And educate, educate, educate. You know, consumers and the public need to be educated about the technologies, about policies and rules and regulations and other things that are available for their use. And with that, I thank you for listening to the Net Metering Solar webinar presented on behalf of the Indiana Sustainable Energy Coalition. Thanks so much.